Good evening. My name is Father Michael Hilbert. I'm associate pastor here at the Church of St. Ignatius Loyola. And on behalf of Father Yesalona, our pastor, and our parish community, you are most welcome to this evening, this lecture. In 1580, a Jesuit priest returned to England. The Queen's spies and priest hunters couldn't deter him from his mission to bring hope to the Catholics in England. This man was once a promising young scholar, favored by the Queen, but later became an enemy of the state. After sneaking back into his home country, he was arrested, convicted of high treason, and sentenced to death. Before his execution, he declared, "I am a Catholic man and a priest, and that faith I have lived, and in that faith do I intend to die." Moments later, he would be hanged, drawn, and quartered for the Catholic faith. He was a true champion, willing to give all for the greater glory of God. St. Edmund Campion served our Lord by willing to give all for him, suffering a brutal martyrdom. He died in the gallows of the ill-famed Tyburn tree in London. Tyburn or Tyburn?
Tyburn.
Tyburn. He is one of the 40 martyrs of England and Wales, and he is recognized in art with a knife in his chest and a noose around his neck. Tomorrow evening at 5:30 p.m. in this church and live-streamed, we will celebrate the Mass of Saints Edmund Campion and his companions. I invite all of you to join us tomorrow as we celebrate the Eucharist in honor of these Jesuit martyrs. But this evening, we are the grateful recipients of a most special gift. As you know, the Metropolitan Museum of Art is currently mounting an exhibition entitled The Tudors, Art and Majesty in Renaissance England. The treasures in that exhibit are of rare beauty and historical importance, and a number of them are on loan from Jesuit institutions in England, including the Jesuit archives and the private collections of our educational centers at Campion Hall at Oxford and Stonyhurst College. Stonyhurst was founded over 400 years ago and is the oldest continually active Jesuit school in the world. You will have to visit the Met to enjoy all the treasures there, but we have the special privilege of having with us Dr. Jan Graffius, a treasure in her own right, and the curator of the collections at Stonyhurst College, who has brought along a number of smaller but precious items from their collections. Dr. Graffius has been in New York with a packed schedule of installing the exhibition at the Met and giving private tours and lectures for some very lucky people. And we are also part of that group. We are thrilled that she has agreed to share with us the stories and the legends of this consequential period of English history through a Jesuit lens. Martyrs, Royalty, and Revolutionaries, Jesuit history told through artifacts, featuring some of the most significant objects held by the British Jesuit Province, Stonyhurst College, and Campion Hall, Oxford. Dr. Graffius, we await your erudition with great pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Is that all right? Thank you. That's Father Michael. That's a hard act to follow. So thank you for your courtesy and for hosting this talk. And I'm hoping that at the end of my presentation, you'll come up and see some of these remarkable objects. Many of these have never left Britain before. Many of these have never actually traveled to be exhibited before. And more than one or two of them have a huge significance. And because you are here present, I hope that you'll be able to encounter them in a very special and personal way. My job at Stonyhurst College is the best job in the world. I am a curator, which means I look after things. I clean things, I dust things, I preserve things. I deal with all sorts of difficult theological, educational, and spiritual problems in relation to the artifacts. And these two pictures are a sort of a microcosm of my job, I think. This is where I am privileged to work. This is Stonyhurst College in the north of England, in Lancashire. It is a beautiful 16th century building which belonged to some various families who we educated. And the big window that you can see on the far side there, the big square window, that's kind of my office. So it's the most wonderful place to work. And as Father Michael has said, it's now the home of the oldest continually surviving Jesuit school in the world. Some 550 pupils, headmaster? 800 pupils between the two schools, and going back over 400 years. A very vibrant community of young men and young women, and I'm very privileged to be very much a part of it. This is one of our 3 beautiful historic libraries. This dates back to the 1830s and houses an extraordinary collection of books which were the gift of a former pupil who died in 1835, and he left about 4,000 books, including a first folio of William Shakespeare, first folio of Ben Jonson, a number of scientific and theological books, and the kind of books that he thought young gentlemen ought to be aware of. So it's very much a show, sort of a show library, but it's also a working library. These are books that the children have access to, can read, can come and consult, as well as scholars from all around the world. So it's a very busy place. The obelisk that you can see there contains relics and paintings of the Martyrs. And I'm a big fan of obelisks containing paintings and relics of the Martyrs. I think everybody should have one in their home. This is our very small but very select museum. It contains a series of changing exhibitions. This is a collection of 15th and 16th century vestments and silver, and you'll hear a little bit more about this later. And this is one of our beautiful classrooms. This is the Square Library, which contains about 20,000 books, mostly of spiritual, devotional, and theological importance, dating back to the 15th century. And as you can see from the slightly startled looks of the young people coming in to study, I bring out all sorts of museum objects to underpin and to illuminate history. It's all very well teaching history from books and from screens, but if you've got things that you can hold, as I hope you will come up and see later, it gives you a special insight into how history works. So here we have, on the book rest in front, the first folio of William Shakespeare, which is open at the play of Richard III. And the skull that you can see is the skull of John Morton, Bishop of Ely, who knew Richard very, very well, hated him, and was the historical source of memory which was used by Shakespeare in forming the version of Richard III that we know nowadays. So in this lesson, we're looking at sources and history and drama and trying to work out how do we know what we know, and what do you take away from a partial and prejudiced source of history, and how do you put that into context? So we have an extraordinary collection. extraordinary collection of national and international significance. We lend objects, as you can see from lending here to the Met, all over the world. That's not normal for a school. That is not usual. Why do we have these objects? I'll give you a little bit of a history lesson, if I may, just to put it in context. So this is a drawing of our founder. His name is Robert Parsons. He was an English Jesuit. He was the companion with Edmund Campion, who Father Michael has so beautifully introduced for us. And in 1580, Robert Parsons and Edmund Campion were sent as underground missionaries to England. That's kind of an odd concept. In England, under Elizabeth I, Catholicism was illegal. It was not only illegal, it incurred the death penalty for priests, it incurred the death penalty for people who were converted to Catholicism, and it incurred the death penalty for people who sheltered priests. And the government, the English government, was trying to strangle and choke out Catholicism, doing it through a mixture of heavy fines and draconian penalties, and ultimately through the death penalty. So Robert Parsons and Edmund Campion spent about 18 months working as undercover priests in England. Their main job was to travel in secret from house to house, from Catholic house to Catholic house, bringing the sacraments to families who had maybe been without presence of any access to the sacraments. No baptisms, no marriages, no confession, no Eucharist for between 5, 6, 7, or 8 years. So they would come into a house and they would spend 24 hours literally going through everything they possibly could, blessing graves, regularizing marriages, blessing children, hearing confessions, preaching, administering the sacrament, and then going, because 48 hours beyond that, the word would get around and it would be too dangerous. As Father Michael has said, in 1581, Edmund Campion was betrayed and captured, taken off, tortured, and executed in December 1581. Robert Parsons managed to evade his captors and escaped back to Europe. And what he took with him, what he took back with him, was an abiding memory of the need of English Catholic parents to have their children educated in their own religion. That was not possible in England. And so he decided that the only way that this was going to work was to set up a school in exile. In fact, across the Channel. The English Channel is about 20 miles wide, and the nearest port after Dover on the southeast of England is Calais. So he got permission from King Philip of Spain, who ruled that part of the world, to set up a school in Calais for English young men, boys. And this rather enigmatic picture is an engraving. It's a Jesuit puzzle picture. In the 16th and 17th century, the Jesuits did a lot of teaching through puzzle pictures, a little bit like crosswords or what's the thing that they do now, Wordle or Sudoku or something like that. So it's a mixture of using your mind and your intellect and trying to work out what's going on. So this engraving, which dates from 1640, is the image, it's a symbol of Jesuit education. It's based on the fact that the Roman poet Ovid wrote a book called Metamorphoses, in which he described the fact that bears, you can see the bear there, give birth to unshapen young, wriggling little furry maggots. And over the next sort of year of the bear's life, the bear cub's life, the mother with her rough tongue licks the bears into shape. And that's a metaphor for Jesuit education. So through the tongue of the teacher, the children are formed to be their best selves. So this is a metaphor for Jesuit education. And what Robert Parsons did was set up a school in Saint-Omer at which young boys could come to be away from their families, to be in exile, but to learn about their religion and to learn moreover, how to defend it and how to protect themselves when they left school at the age of 18 and came back to England. So this is our school in France in the 1680s. It's a little bit like an Oxford college. It's also like a village. There'd be about 180 boys here, so not a huge school by any means, but it has theaters, it has orchestra rooms, It has 3 chapels. It has a print house. It has a slaughterhouse. It has a hospital. It has 3 football pitches, very important for small children. And it also has classrooms. So this is where generations of young boys came to be educated in exile. So much for being at school. Why am I here with all of these objects? And why do we have these objects? And that is really a very important part of our story. This is a still from the exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum, the Tudor exhibition. If you haven't been already, I do urge you to go. It's absolutely breathtaking. But the large cope that you can see here has a huge significance for our school. This cope was part of a set of 15th century vestments commissioned by King Henry VII in about 1495 at a cost of, in those days, £100,000. If you can imagine £100,000 500 years ago, the sheer extravagance of this commission is difficult to imagine. And the cope has his political and royal credentials on it. It's not a very religious garment. There's not a lot of religion on it. Very few saints. On the back of the hood is a small annunciation with the Virgin Mary and the angel Gabriel. But what you can see when you look at that is power. Henry VII's royal power and the power of his political backing, the House of Lancaster. He commissioned 29 of these, but during the Reformation, Henry VIII and then his son, Edward VI, began to destroy and attack the material culture, the things that made Catholicism significant. If you're going to attack a religion or a culture and try and suppress it, the first thing you do is you go for the buildings, you go for the books, you go for the fabrics and the textiles, all the outward show that allows people to express what they believe, and that's what they did in the Reformation. So these copes were being destroyed. They were being turned into cushions and soft furnishings. They were being burnt. And one cope, this one, was rescued and hidden and smuggled across to the school, where in 1609 it was used in a procession by a visiting cardinal, a visiting papal nuncio, who wrote about it and described it as an object of memory. And an object of memory is the definition of a museum. So from 1609, we base our claim to be the oldest museum in the English-speaking world. The engraving that you can see here is not that procession, it's a slightly later one. The Jesuits were famous for their lavish, pyrotechnical, and extremely impressive displays. There is, in our school archives, there is a description of a play that was put on in 1622 to commemorate the canonization of St. Ignatius Loyola. And in the market square, in the town, they built 2 40-foot statues of St. Ignatius and St. Francis Xavier. And on the other side of the square, they built 2 40-foot statues of heresy and ignorance. And they filled heresy and ignorance full of fireworks and gunpowder. And then they had a fuse going from the mouth of Ignatius to the fingertip of heresy, and a fuse going from the fingertip of Francis Xavier to the mouth of ignorance. And then they sent a small boy up a ladder to light the fuse, and the fireworks exploded. And according to the archives, the townspeople were deafened for 3 days. So procession and public procession was really important to the way that the school validated itself and made itself part of the community. So here you can see part of this sort of tradition of display. This is a beautiful silver statue of St. Thomas Becket, which contains a relic of Thomas Becket's skull, which was rescued from the destruction of Becket's shrine at the orders of Henry VIII. And this used to be proceeded through the town on a pole in procession. And opposite, you can see the musical and dramatic performance to receive a very famous relic at our school in 1629, the hair of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The procession to receive this relic consisted of 40 barges and 300 children dressed as the nine choirs of angels and archangels, singing different songs and praising the Virgin Mary. It lasted for 3 days. So drama, procession, performance, very important to the school. And you can see here, this is one of our early plays, and on the other side, the first folio of William Shakespeare. Our school was the first school in the world to perform performance of Shakespeare. The first school performance of any Shakespeare play took place at our school in 1624. And the plays that you can see here, these were written for the boys to perform. There is a wonderful version of the life of Henry VIII in which, at the end of the play, Henry VIII is pondering his many, many crimes and wondering if he will get away with it when he dies and goes to heaven. And just in case he's, under any illusions that he's not going to get away with it, this massive angel appears with a flaming sword and says, "No chance. You've killed you've killed John Fisher, and you've killed Thomas More. You're going to end up very badly." And at which point, 3 smaller angels come on with a huge pot of boiling water, and Henry VIII is tipped into the pot of boiling water. You can imagine how 14-year-old boys would appreciate this. So the college collected all these extraordinary items which were being destroyed or hidden or at risk in England, and also were very dangerous for people to keep. If you were suspected of being a Catholic, you could have your house raided at any time. And if you had relics or medieval prayer books or vestments in your house, you would be at serious risk of imprisonment. So the school suddenly became a sanctuary for very important relics. And on the far side here, you can see in this reliquary is a rope that tied Edmund Campion to a wicker hurdle that dragged him to execution. And here is a corporal embroidered with the names of 5 martyrs who said their last prayers in the Tower of London before they too were executed, including Alexander Bryant, who was executed along with Edmund Campion. And then later relics of the 16th century and the 17th century. This is a piece of cloth, blood-stained cloth, from our first martyr. Our school has 21 martyrs, 3 of whom are canonized, and this is a piece of cloth from Father Thomas Garnet. And the quote is from the lady who gathered it, Donna Luisa de Carvajal, who lived in London in the early 17th century, and who spent the time that she was there collecting relics of the various priests who were being executed. This strip of linen is from the shirt in which Father Thomas Garnet suffered on July the 3rd, 1608. I bought it from the executioner. I held it in my hands and cut some strips from it, including this one. He was my friend and master. So to have that connection back to somebody who was at our school as a pupil, and to have this relic come back to the school and be treasured at the school is very special. This, I have to say, is my favorite object in the world. This is the right eye of a Jesuit martyr, Edward Oldcorn, who was executed in 1606 for supposedly being involved in the gunpowder plot, but really he was simply executed because he was a Jesuit priest. The eyeball was taken out of England very quickly because these things were too dangerous to keep in England, and brought across to our school. And the martyrs around the Christian world were very much a part of the cultural formation of the boys. These terrible picture of the martyrs of the Jesuits in Japan in the 1620s, the news came back very quickly to the school, and the boys at the school really identified with it because a lot of the martyrs in Japan were children. And so plays started to be performed relating to the little Japanese boys who were being martyred, and the children at the school connected with it and identified with it. And what it did was it gave them comfort to realize that what was happening to them in England was not unique. It was happening in a worldwide community. So as well as relics speaking of persecution and struggle for survival, the school also started to collect items of pre-Reformation significance. This is a 12th century beautiful book of the homilies of Gregory the Great, and a 15th century prayer book. I love this beautiful image of the Annunciation to the shepherds, mainly because the shepherds all have torn knees, which reminds me of mending my son's trousers after football matches, time and time and time again. And also royalty. One of the things in the title for this talk was royalty. Why was royalty important? Not simply because these were kings and queens, but because of this idea of continuity. The Reformation drove a massive division through centuries of English Catholic worship, and the fabric of English Catholic society was torn apart at the Reformation. And this must have been hugely disorientating for many, many Catholic families. And so to look back before the Reformation to a time when England was a fully Catholic country, when the king and queen, when the royal family, when the government were all Catholic, was very, very comforting. So Catholic artifacts that related to royalty before the great division of Henry VIII had a huge significance. And this signature is in fact this book here that I have. This is the mother of Henry VIII. This was her private prayer book. Elizabeth Plantagenet, the Queen. And these books were treasured because of their connection to a time before the Reformation, encouraging the young boys at the school to think maybe there'll be a time when we'll go back to what we had before. This beautiful 15th century prayer book, which is also here on the table, belonged to Queen Elizabeth of York's lady-in-waiting, a very erudite young woman called Catherine Bray, who commissioned this beautiful book from the personal illuminator of the Emperor Maximilian in Europe. So this is an indication before the Reformation of how intricately tied up England was with Catholic Europe. And then we come to the very important and beautiful Thomas More relics that we have here. I don't need to introduce Thomas More to you, I'm quite sure. One of the great martyrs of Henry VIII, hugely scholarly, witty, a great statesman, a great lawyer, and a very principled individual. So we have in our collections this extraordinarily beautiful crucifix. On the back, there you can see, is a Greek inscription saying that the crucifix contains a relic of a tooth of Thomas the Apostle. And from the painting there that you can see, that's a 1532 painting by Hans Holbein of Alice More, Thomas's second wife. You can see that she's wearing this cross. So this was a gift to Alice More from Thomas, one that she treasured and that she passed on to her daughter-in-law, and that her daughter-in-law passed on to her daughter-in-law. And for 6 generations, it passed from mother-in-law to daughter-in-law as a way of welcoming young women into the family and saying to them, you're now part of this tradition, this handing on of the Thomas More memory. And it stayed within the More family until 1755, when Father Thomas More, the 8th grandson of St. Thomas More, was a Jesuit, and he was the provincial of the Jesuits, and he had no children to pass it on to, and so he gave it to his old school, to our school, and it's treasured to this day. Now, this is something that I would really encourage you after this talk to come up and experience for yourself. It's very tiny, it's about that size. It belonged to St. Thomas More. It was his personal crucifix, and it was something that he wore underneath the famous hair shirt that I'm sure you've all heard about. He wore a hair shirt as an act of penance, a continual reminder amid all the richness and the corruption of the court and the government that he worked in, of the pain and the suffering of the crucifixion, that he had to constantly remind himself not to be drawn into the world, but to keep this sort of the suffering that Christ endured for his sake to the forefront. And this little cross was worn underneath the hair shirt, and you can see the little spikes on the arms of the cross. It looks like just rough wood. They're made of gold, but actually they're razor sharp. So this was an act of mortification, which was designed to cause further discomfort and to draw blood. And this, we're not quite sure how it passed from Thomas More to his family, probably through his daughter, Margaret Roper, who was the last visitor before his execution. And it stayed in the More family until the 1880s, when it was given to the school. This beautiful, extraordinarily gorgeous reliquary, designed by the famous court artist Hans Holbein, was also a personal property of Thomas More. On the front, you can see the image of St. George of England killing a very spotty dragon, and on the back, an image of Christ, the resurrected Christ, sitting on his tomb, surrounded by the objects of the crucifixion. This reliquary was very personal to Thomas More, and around the rim of the reliquary was a quote from Virgil, which was drawn from Virgil's poem about St. George, and was saying effectively, this will pass, all these things will pass. So it was a reminder to Thomas More that when things were difficult, he had to cling to the images and the examples of the saints and bear in mind that difficult things would pass. Continuing the idea of royalty, this beautiful little red velvet-bound prayer book originally belonged to Mary Tudor, and it's here on the table in front of me. You can see on one side the Tudor rose for Henry VIII, and on the other side the pomegranate, which was the badge of Catherine of Aragon. This book was commissioned by Mary Tudor, but she never lived to see it. She died before the book was complete, and it passed to the only other Catholic queen called Mary, who claimed the throne of England, who was part Tudor, and that was Mary, Queen of Scots. The book was on the scaffold at Fotheringay when Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed, and it passed through the hands of her lady-in-waiting, Elizabeth Curll, to Elizabeth's nephew, who was a Jesuit librarian, and it came to the school in the 1650s, 1660s. And on the far side here, you can see a relic of the crown of thorns. The single thorn in the middle was given to Mary, Queen of Scots, when she married into the French royal family. She kept it close to her, and she passed it to Thomas Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, and he passed it to his daughter, and she passed it to her Jesuit chaplain. So you can see these threads of Jesuits being used as rescuers and salvagers and sanctuary for these very, very important and significant objects. I don't have a picture of this remarkable object here, which I hope you'll come and see afterwards. It's an Agnus Dei. An Agnus Dei is made of beeswax. I didn't know until I started work at the college that the Pope had his own bees. They were papal bees, and they made papal beeswax. And the first Easter, after a new Pope was created, he would create these beautiful Agnus Dei, which has an image of the Lamb of God, and they would be stamped with special inscriptions, and they'd be given out to special and favored people. They were meant to protect you from harm, to protect you from storms and tempests and fires, and from difficult childbirth, and they were much, much favored. This particular Agnus Dei was given to Edmund Campion in 1580 by Gregory XIII, as he was about to come back to England on his terribly difficult and dangerous mission. And it's unusually large. Most Agnus Dei are about that size. I've never seen one this size before. And if you can imagine, Edmund Campion hunted from house to house, hiding, traveling, never sure when he was going to be arrested or disturbed, carrying this with him. How did it survive? He was arrested, betrayed and arrested in 1581 in a house in the south of England called Lyford Grange. And in 1959, nearly 400 years later, this Agnus Dei was found hidden in the roof in the attics in Lyford Grange, where the family had taken Campion's possessions and put them out of sight so that they would stay safe. So it's a remarkable survival and a very close and direct link to Edmund Campion. I couldn't come to America without bringing something of American significance, and I hope that you will appreciate this. This is the title page of a book of Latin poetry by a Polish Jesuit called Casimir, whose poetry was so famous in the 17th century, it was a standard set text in every Jesuit college throughout the world. Beautiful poetry written in Latin, and all pupils were required to learn this by heart. So the inscriptions that you can see there at the top, it says Bibliotheca Scholastica, the children's library, the schoolboys' library. And then underneath, second in the class of syntax, John Carroll, 1751. And then underneath, Charles Carroll. I don't have to explain to you who John and Charles Carroll were, but there are some British people in the audience, so I will explain to them. John Carroll and Charles Carroll came from the famous Maryland family. John Carroll was the first bishop, Catholic bishop in America, and the founder of Georgetown University. And his cousin Charles, or Charlie, as he was usually known, was the only Catholic signatory of the Declaration of Independence. Both boys, and in fact 11 other members of the Carroll family, including Daniel, the framer of the Constitution, came to our school to be educated. Now, it's something to imagine parents sending their boys from Dover across the Channel to England, to France, about 20 miles in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. It's something else again to imagine parents sending 10 and 11 and 12-year-old boys across the Atlantic Ocean in the 17th and 18th century, not to see their boys for maybe 10 years. And yet, many families, particularly in Maryland, which had similarly repressive anti-Catholic religious laws to England, many of them did so. And I think we educated 13 Carrolls, as I said before. So John came in the late 1740s, and Charlie, his younger cousin, with him. And this book belonged originally to John and then was passed on to Charlie. We have some lovely sort of personal reminders in our archives. Archives often seen as being terribly dry and dusty. Archives are full of life and full of excitement if you know how to look for it. So this is the letter book of the college. All letters that came in were logged. Where did the letter come from? What was the date? What was the substance of the letter? The letters themselves have not survived, but we know that they existed. So if you can see, third one down, Mr. Carroll, 1744, with an enclosure with a letter for his son, wonders he does not hear from him. So maybe the young Carrolls were not that good at letter writing, possibly. Other items in the archives relate to fishing rods and gloves and very, very beautifully elaborate shoes. So the young Carroll boys were well-founded in pocket money and in toys and sporting equipment. So getting back to that poetry book that we looked at, the frontispiece has a very beautiful engraving of the muse of poetry and the infant Pindar, the great Greek poet that was one of the inspirations for Casimir's poetry. And one of the two Carrolls, either John, your first bishop in America and the founder of Georgetown, or Charles, your Declaration Independence signer, thought it would be funny to draw Maryland tobacco pipes into the mouths of the muse of poetry and to put, in fact, a tobacco pipe into the arms of Pope Urban VIII between the Barberini bees. So this is a reminder that no matter how great young boys, young men, young women grow up to be in later life, they are still children, and they can get very bored during Latin poetry lessons. On the other side of the screen, you can see a poem written by Charles Carroll about Francis Xavier. These poems were written and performed in public, and Charles Carroll wrote 3 separate poems that have survived in our archives, 2 of which are on the subject of religious freedom and state oppression of conscience. So you can imagine as a young teenager, 15, 16, 17, he's absorbing all of these lessons about what it is to live under state repression, what it is to live in a place where you cannot freely exert your conscience. And these stood him in very good stead when he returned to America in the 1770s. A small side effect, or a sort of sideline, is that John Carroll, when he left school, became a teacher and a Jesuit. He taught at our school, and in 1773, the Jesuit order was suppressed internationally. It was a great disaster for the Jesuits. And throughout the world, all Jesuit possessions were ordered to be seized by the local authorities or by local governments. And this is the inventory of the contents of John Carroll's bedroom at our school in Bruges. Now, All of the other priests are in this inventory, and their bedroom contents typically include one bed, one chair, a washstand, a small bookcase with maybe 10 or 12 books. That's it. John Carrolls runs to 5 pages and includes silver tea sets, swords, massive numbers of reliquaries, and the entire body of St. Gordianus, who has survived thanks to John Carroll's protection in his bedroom at that school in Bruges, has survived to this day and is now under the altar in our Sodality Chapel. And there he is, Gordianus, a 4th century Roman martyr, given to the Pope in 1667 and protected from seizure by Father John Carroll in 1773. So I'll just flick through quickly a few other beautiful and hopefully inspiring objects that we look after at the college at Stonyhurst. These are, in fact, examples of Protestant texts. The red inscriptions that you can see there are in the hands of the young Anglican cleric Thomas Cranmer, who was Henry VIII's great architect of the Church of England. In this, he is making comments on the Eucharist and transubstantiation, on Irenaeus, on heresy, and on Erasmus. So this is him working out his personal theology. And the larger picture is an image of the first New Testament published in English by William Tyndale in the 1520s, which was illegal, and to own which in England at the time merited burning at the stake. Beautiful 17th century embroideries by a number of women whose job it was, or whose self-appointed role it was, to support the missionaries working in England and to provide them with all of the vestments that they would need to say Mass, so that they didn't have to carry vestments, incriminating vestments, from house to house to house. And women all over England sat down and turned their own dress fabric and their own jewelry boxes into these extraordinarily beautiful vestments, and in many cases identified themselves. You can see the AMDG here. This is a vestment from about 1650, and the HW is Helena Winter, who was an Englishwoman whose father was executed as one of the gunpowder plotters, and who spent her entire adult life sheltering Jesuit priests, supporting their mission, and making these extraordinarily beautiful vestments. We also have a beautiful art collection. This is one of our engravings by Albrecht Dürer. I include it mainly because I can't get over the fact that the great Saint Anthony, is wiggling his toes in the sunshine, and it's a very human touch, which I find very endearing. This is a manuscript by the great Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, who taught at our school in the 1870s and 1880s. And we have world collections wherever the Jesuits went throughout the world, and wherever our pupils went throughout the world as travelers, scientists, naturalists, missionaries. They collected items from the great world cultures, world religions, and brought them back to Stonyhurst, where they are still displayed. This gorgeous globe is the 11th oldest Islamic globe in the world. It's dated 1623, the same year as the publication of Shakespeare's First Folio. And it's used by Islamic astronomers to identify the location of Mecca. It's a globe of the heavens, and to use it, you have to imagine that you are standing at the shoulder of God, looking down on the heavens, and inside the globe is the earth. And this extraordinary collection of the Incas of Peru, part of the Jesuits' encouragement of the people of Peru to claim their heritage, which had been, in many cases, eradicated or blurred by slavery and by occupation, to reclaim their heritage and to be proud of it. Also, we have a lot of natural history specimens. This is a vampire bat. It's one of my favorite objects. And to bring things up to the present day, it's not just history. It's not just stuff that happened hundreds of years ago. I do a lot of work in El Salvador, and this is the alb that St. Oscar Romero was wearing when he was murdered, which I have cleaned and conserved and removed mildew and mold from. And it's a very shocking reminder of the price that people pay nowadays for speaking truth to power. And in El Salvador, it's a very powerful signal and a reminder to them that the lies that were peddled after Romero was murdered by his own government, who had ordered his murder, that the lies they had peddled, that he was killed by revolutionaries, he was killed by, by disgruntled left-wing revolutionaries, are not true. You cannot look at that and not realize this was a very violent death which had been ordered at the hands of his own government. So where are we now? We are putting on an exhibition of the women of the 17th century who supported the English Jesuits and the English Catholic missionaries. We have a film and a beautiful exhibition. It's entitled Hot Holy Ladies. This, in fact, is a totally respectable historical reference which was printed in 1602 by a disgruntled priest who was very cross that the women, the educated, intelligent, and independent women of the 17th century England were supporting the Jesuits in their mission. And he wrote this book saying that these hot holy ladies were deluded by the heat of their zeal for the Jesuit mission, and they should really go back home and make their husbands dinner and stop getting involved in difficult and dangerous activities. So exhibitions and films and podcasts can be found on these two websites, jesuitcollections.org.uk, which is our collaboration with the Jesuit Archives and the Jesuit Collections in London, and our own website. And I hope you will visit them and have a look at them and become part of this extraordinary cultural venture that we have at Stonyhurst. So I've talked for a long time. I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to invite, maybe Father Michael would like to come and... Be very happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Dr. Graffius, or observations, or shall we just kind of come up and see these? Yes, out there. The question is, why did...
Why is the vampire bat there? Is that what you're asking? Yeah, I kind of skipped over the vampire bat. The collections have a huge collection of natural history materials. The vampire bat is part of a collection put together by a man called Charles Waterton in the 1820s. And he was the first naturalist and the first nature preservationist. He put together the first nature reserve probably anywhere in the world in his estate in Yorkshire. As a young man, he came to our school, and he was fascinated by nature. The Jesuit teachers couldn't work out how to keep this kid in the classes. He wanted all the time to be out collecting animals. So they struck a deal with him. If he did his Latin and his arithmetic and his English in the morning, in the afternoon he could go rambling and collect animals. So as an adult, he went to Guyana and he collected animals and he brought them back to England. And he had this passion for nature not to be polluted, not to be disturbed by humankind. So he built a huge wall around his estate in Yorkshire and preserved the animals in his estate. And he was very much the inspiration for the great modern natural historian David Attenborough. David Attenborough is a huge fan of Charles Waterton and credits him with some of the impetus for him becoming a naturalist and a natural historian. So that's why the vampire bat is there.
Yes. I think for the live stream, it helps if we speak into the microphone. Thank you.
Can I ask a bit about the pupils at Stonyhurst, just a bit more about how they can engage in the collections and learn from them? And
That's a very good point. the point I made about the cope in the procession with the fireworks and so on, that back in 1609, that was the first indication that these objects are meant to be used and experienced as part of the children's educational formation. So for 400 and more years, the objects in the collections have not been things stuck behind glass or shoved in a cupboard. They're not dead objects. They all have a purpose. They all have a story to tell. And throughout the 4 centuries of the college's existence, they've been used to illuminate, to provoke, to argue, and to allow children to develop their own sense of where they are in the world and in a cultural sense. So nowadays, we teach hundreds of hours per year of pupil lessons using objects. So the children get to handle things, they get to experience things, they get to ask questions. We teach them about conservation and about the science involved in looking after objects. And it's a way of experiencing history and theology that is unique. Children learn through touching things and handling things as much as they learn through their ears. So if you can, one of the lessons I teach is on fossils. So you bring out some of the fossils and you ask the children to hold out their hand and you plonk this fossil in their hand. And it might be the tooth of a megalodon, one of those huge sharks. It might actually be a piece of fossilized dinosaur poo. And once they've handled that, there's no going back. It's a way of engaging them. So that's very much what we do. They're used very much as part of the children's experience of education, unorthodox experience.
When I saw the skull there with Shakespeare's folio, I thought of poor Yorick, last poor Yorick, Hamlet, but...
Not quite.
Yes. Could you?
Was there, outside of the artifacts that you shared associated with Thomas More, was there any other connection between the Jesuits and Thomas More's life that you are aware of?
The Thomas More artifacts passed down through the Thomas More family, and many of the Thomas More family became Jesuits. So there's Father Henry More in the 1650s, and then Father Thomas More in the 1750s. So many of Thomas More's descendants became Jesuits, and that's the link. So these objects here passed from Thomas More to his son John, and then down until they came into the hands of the Jesuit grandsons or great-grandsons. So there's very much a link. And many of the More family, Thomas More had quite a few children, and he had quite a few descendants. And most of the boys from the Thomas More family came to our school to be educated. So not all of them became Jesuits, but they were very much associated with the school. So, and I hope you'll come and have a look at these and experience them for yourself.
Well, I think all that remains is for us to come up forward and to touch these precious relics and other objects of devotion that you've brought. You can tell more stories as we come forward. Shall we move the table to the center, or we just, you will?
Good idea. No, I'll move the table. I'll also put this off so I don't.
Okay. And I guess we can turn this off then too. I don't know how to do that now. Okay.
Thank you. So if you'd like to come and have a closer look.